we're telling the international community, you have to support us because this is the only way to keep stability in the region. By doing so, and with the support they received from the international community, they created the conditions for the revolutions we have seen. Actually, I think that these countries are facing, I wouldn't like to generalize too much. I think if we just take the case of Egypt, Libya and Tunisia, you have completely different countries, completely different problems. But if I can give a general idea about the three of them, I would say that there are two serious problems there. One is deep polarization in the society, and the other one is, especially in the case of Egypt, a very deep economic crisis, a very serious social economic conditions that make things really complicated. These are the two problems they have to address, and whatever the regime, whatever the situation, if the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Tunisians and the international community are not able to solve these two, we will not see stability in the region. No matter how many security establishments, no matter how many efforts are made, and probably no one reinforced more the security establishment than Mubarak, with a very strong military, very strong interior ministry and very strong intelligence, and it was not able to prevent, not even to anticipate a revolution, which was not a revolution for democracy. Only cultivated Egyptians know what is democracy as a theoretical concept, but Egyptians never lived in democracy. They only knew in the past the Nasser, the Sadat and the Mubarak dictatorships. So for average Egyptians, these revolutions were about dignity, were about improving their life conditions, were about having the opportunity to participate, to feel that they were heard by the system. It has, of course, a political meaning, and it has, of course, an economic meaning, but this was the essence of these revolutions. So sometimes when we talk about the situation in the Arab Spring countries, there is a sense of frustration. Maybe people thought spring, this is 3 months, and then we will have the summer, another 3 months, and now we have the winter. But this is not the kind of time measure we should have for such transitions. Let's think of the cases we know better. We are here Bulgarian, Spanish. We have lived transitions. We know that it can be very, very long. And sometimes I read newspapers in my own country, in Spain, and still you can see people saying the transition is not over for the judiciary, transition is not over for the national or the regional problems in some regions in Spain. It takes time, of course, to go from a centralized dictatorship to a modern, plural, democratic society. But let's take again the example of Egypt. I was talking about the serious economic crisis. You have almost half of the population living with $2 a day. Half of this group, around 20% of the Egyptian population, live with $1 a day. And if the system is not able to include them, to provide opportunities for them, in my opinion, stability will not be possible. The same thing about polarization. This has not been so far a debate between democracy and non-democracy. This is not the debate in Egypt. It's a debate about power. You have groups fighting for power, the establishment that was running the country in the past, afterwards the Muslim Brothers, but I haven't seen the mainstream groups in Egypt really working for transformation. It is about transformation into a modern society, and it is about power sharing. I think if we did something well in Spain, in the Spanish transition, was to convert consensus and what we used to call in Spain the spirit of transition, the consensus, a sacred word, something that couldn't be challenged by anyone. If political decisions were taken in the context of consensus, they were good by principle. And if they were not taken in a spirit of consensus, they were not good, no matter what are the reasons, and this is the case still today. Recently, the government that has a majority has passed a law on education. And people are saying this is not a good law because there's no consensus, even if the government has the majority, even if it is perfectly legal and legitimized to vote for a majority in parliament. The critics say it is not consensus based, as it was the case with similar laws. I'm not here to criticize the Spanish government. It has been the case with governments from my own party in the past. So this idea of a joint project of society is not present there. This is what explains the deep polarization. Now we have a new government in Egypt after all the revolts, what has been defined as the second wave of the revolution by some people after the 30th June, the military intervention, and we have a new leadership in the country, and this new leadership also considers, like the previous government, that there's little room for this joint project. Let's analyze the pattern today, and let's analyze the pattern with President Morsi. Let's start with Morsi. We had a government with little interest to include politically the opposition. We have an opposition with little interest to reach a deal with the president and his government. We have a non-efficient economic team, and we have an international community which was considering that Egypt could do well, that was not working so much for this integrated approach, was, in other words, divided between some countries supporting one side, some countries supporting the other side. I think we failed in the international community to work in a more determined way for this integrated approach. This was the case with Morsi. What is the situation today? We could use exactly the same pattern. A government which is not integrating successfully the opposition, that opposition from the FJP. That opposition itself is not interested in reaching a deal with the government. It's still too early to say, but some people start to think that in Egypt there's no an efficient economic team. And again, the international community continues to be mainly polarized in supporting one or the others. So it's sad, but we have the same pattern. We change seats, and people who were in government are now in opposition or in jail or prosecuted, and those who were in opposition or prosecuted in the past are now in the government, but the pattern is the same. And I don't think we can build stability on this basis. So, if I know we have just 10 minutes for these introductory remarks, sorry if I'm speaking too much, but let me conclude, and I hope later we will have the opportunity to debate, that it is through this consensus and through serious efforts to overcome the very serious economic, financial, social challenges Egypt has, and we could say the same about Tunisia or the same about Libya, that stability will be possible. And there are no magic solutions for these problems. We cannot think of a quick fix in the case of Egypt. It is going to take time. The European Union is working very hard for this inclusion, for this consensus. We are not naive. We know that this is not going to happen in a matter of weeks or months. It is going to take years, if not maybe decades, but this is the only way these countries will be able to build a strong democratic system where all important trends will be included. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure your presentation will, thank you, will raise questions also in the question answers time. I'm going quickly to give the floor to Anas. Anas El Gomati is the founder of the first Libyan think tank. He's going to talk to us, obviously, from a local perspective, if there is a tension between democratization and stability/security, and to which extent the expectations of the people have really been met to date.
Thank you, Vessela. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great honor and pleasure to be around so many distinguished guests and to be around so much interesting minds and diverse minds in the audience. And I suppose that's a good kind of departure point to discuss the pluralism and the plurality of the Arab world. But also it's this strange paradox is appearing, because we talk of an Arab Spring when there are only 4 or arguably 5 countries within the Spring. So we're really talking about a partial spring, number one. There are 22 countries in the Arab world. Only 4 are going through democratization. So I suppose we have to kind of really think very hard about the terms and the analytical kind of mileage that some of these terms have. That also means about the time frame for some of these transitions. And it sounds like I'm concluding my remarks, but I've not even started. But I suppose when we look at the other transitions that have happened in the last 30 to 40 years, if we look at the 70s and 80s in Latin America, 30 countries came into transition within a space of a year, bar Cuba, of course, and they all fell and transitioned towards democracy in 1 year. The very same thing happened here in the early 90s, 1991, in Central and Eastern Europe, with countries falling very, very quickly and then transitioning towards democracy. Many people have asked whether or not there is an African Spring. When that spring happened 25, 30 years ago, in fact 20 years ago in the early 90s, and then carried on within the 2000s, 46 countries fell within those decades, well, within a space of about 10 years. 46 countries all transitioned towards democracy. So why is the Arab world different? Well, one, we shouldn't speak about it being a spring, number one. We could think about them as being detonations and time bombs, if anything. And why were they time bombs? What were the ingredients on the ground? I mean, that's what we're really here to speak about. Well, it wouldn't be a holistic conversation unless we spoke about failed states. I mean, that is the analytical word that's being used within the description of this seating. And I think failed state is brandished very, very often, but I suppose it merits scrutiny. And so I suppose when we speak about a country or a state or a government trying to provide a full spectrum of public security, then it stands in contradistinction to exactly what the Arab Spring or what these detonations or revolutions or uprisings are all about. And I suppose there is this very, very interesting dynamic on the ground that is starting to play out much more openly now, I would say, in the sense of what is it that the government would like to do? Well, obviously increase the amount of stability in their own countries, but how can you do that when you stand in contradistinction to a militiaman, for example, in Libya, who's unwilling to give up his arms? Now, what is standing between them? I mean, it's cheap to think that it's just a political or an ideological difference, when in reality the inherited issues that the Arab world has faced over the last 30 years are incredible. Now, just some facts and figures. You know, when I was born in the Arab world, well, I was born 30 years ago. I wasn't born in the Arab world. 30 years ago, it was around 170 million aggregate population. You're now looking at somewhere in between 345 to 350 million. If you just reflect on those figures for a moment, you start to realize there's a massive burst and a shift in aggregate population. What does it mean? It means that those 170, 75 million that have been born in those last 30 years have inherited problems. What are those inherited problems? Well, they're very much in a similar vein to the descriptions that we heard earlier on. And they are failures in transportation, education, healthcare, unemployment, and across the spectrum, they are socio-economic issues. And unless you respond to socio or macro socio-economic failure across the board, then you're in no doubt going to find much more instability, much more insecurity, and I suppose that's very relevant for the European Union, because in times of fiscal austerity, and let's not be cowards about calling it that, this is an era of fiscal austerity in Europe, you will fall back on very, very old frameworks and your priorities, which will always be securitized in the south. You know, let's not be bashful about trying to call it what it is. So I suppose in that respect, where does it leave democratic transition across the Arab world? I spend a great deal of time in Tunisia and Egypt, and also in Lebanon, but I've also traveled across to Morocco in the last 2 years, and Jordan as well. And I find it interesting to look at the similarities, and there are similarities. These similarities are around, you know, these macro socioeconomic failures. But the interesting hallmark is what has unified all those populations is slogans, in fact. Now, Egypt is an interesting case. In January of 2011, we heard slogans. We heard bread, dignity, and freedom, and justice, obviously, of course. But that is not a programmatic way of achieving a transition. They're just slogans. And I suppose if we hide behind slogans and we hide behind them long enough, then it gives rise to populism. That is the number one threat today in the Arab world. The rise of populism, the very same that happened in the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, is something that I don't have to give anybody here a history lesson around. It's a very, very bad recipe for the next few decades. And I suppose unless you respond to them accurately, unless you respond to them with new ways and creative ways of thinking outside the box, and not falling out into this tried old, you know, IMF recipe, which quite frankly is disastrous. I mean, to look at it as though it's a savior, to look at it as though it's the golden chalice, it's a poison chalice. People in Tunisia know it, people in Egypt know it. In Libya, albeit a wealthy country, wealthy in inverted commas, this is a poison chalice. I mean, it stands again in contradistinction to everything that those slogans were around. What are the three main IMF policies? Cutting in subsidies, massive taxation, and probably crippling debt. Now, as an Arab person, the word for bread in Libya is khubz, but the word for bread in Egypt is aish, and aish comes from the word to live. So if you want to cut subsidies in wheat, then good luck, because you'll see what the kind of rampant instability that you will cause from those things. You'll see the rampant protests and democratic shifts that you'll see from those very, very things. And I think that is just a hallmark of the international community in the way in which it is engaged in the Arab world. It is not about trying to understand equity. It's very, very predatory, and I think that's something that we all have to share in the failure of. And I suppose I call it a failure because even though the 4.8 billion loan hasn't been given to Egypt yet, when it will be given to them, it's the little man on the ground, the young Egyptian that is going to grow up in decades of probably more inequity and probably more economic instability and probably more poverty, which again was the very reason why they came out. I mean, Mohammed Bouazizi, when he came out in Tunisia in late 2010, when he burnt himself, it might have been about dignity, it might have been about justice, but it was also about the fact that he was a fruit and veg seller trying to provide for his sisters and brothers, and because he couldn't feed himself, he burnt himself. There was absolutely no outlet there. Now, I sat with a member of the Constituent Assembly in Tunisia, Mabrouk and Barka, who told me personally that the IMF are rushing us into signing a deal that is bad for Tunisians. That's the real question. I mean, that's the real question today. I mean, I have many Libyans that are asking me to go back to international fora and many Egyptians and Tunisians by chance as well, and tell the international community, what are you doing? What are you doing? I mean, this is not an economic recipe that works for the Arab world, but it's certainly not one that has worked for most of Europe as well. So I'm sorry to be so contentious about this issue, but I suppose I have to give it up there. Is Libya a failed state? I'd say it's a very, very weak state, and it's inherently weak. It's inherently weak because it has over 4,300 kilometers of porous border. There's nothing you can do about that. When the EU mission UBAM came to Libya and spoke about border management, most people thought it was about border control. And I suppose the first thing is you have to shift those words. It's not about control, it's about management. You can never control a border that big. You can't control the American-Mexican border, which is 30 times smaller. How can you control the Libyan borders?